Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the summer of 1887, the Arkansas Gazette published a brief notice about the discovery of human remains on an isolated property in the Ozark Hills of Carroll County. The article, barely 5 paragraphs long, mentioned that local authorities had been called to investigate suspicious circumstances at a homestead in an area locally known as Crow Hollow. What this modest report failed to mention was that this discovery would lead to the uncovering of one of the most horrific family crimes in American history, a case that would remain largely undocumented in mainstream historical accounts for over a century. The story begins with a letter, a simple piece of correspondence that arrived at the county sheriff's office from a concerned relative in Missouri who hadn't heard from their family members in nearly 8 months. The Thurman family, Jacob, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, had stopped responding to letters, and no one had seen them at the local church or general store since the previous autumn. What initially appeared to be a routine welfare check would quickly transform into something far more sinister. When Deputy Marshal Thomas Blackwood arrived at the remote homestead, the overwhelming stench led him to a shallow grave behind the barn, where he discovered the first set of remains. As authorities continued their search, 5 more burial sites were uncovered across the property. The subsequent investigation would reveal that all 6 family members had been systematically murdered over a period of several weeks, their disappearances concealed by the property's isolation. Most disturbing were the journal entries found inside the home, meticulously detailing the events leading up to and following each death. These writings, penned by the family's distant cousin who had been invited to stay with them that winter, revealed a calculated plan born of inheritance, greed, and growing psychosis. The documents describe not just the methods of killing, but the killer's disturbing rationalization of each act as a form of necessary cleansing. The case never went to trial. The perpetrator was found hanging from an oak tree on the property, having taken his own life after completing the final journal entry. These horrific events, too gruesome for most publications of the era, were quickly suppressed by local officials concerned about the county's reputation. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten history of what became known as the Invitation of Crow Hollow. Crow Hollow, Arkansas, 1887, a remote valley nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains, approximately 12 miles northeast of Berryville, the Carroll County seat. The area was named for the unusual number of crows that congregated in the dense oak and hickory forests surrounding the narrow valley. Local superstition held that crows gathered where death lingered. In this case, the folklore would prove grimly prophetic. The hollow consisted of scattered homesteads separated by miles of dense woodland, limestone bluffs, and steep ravines. County records from 1880 show fewer than 15 families claiming land in the area. The isolation was profound. During winter months, some residents might go weeks without seeing another soul beyond their immediate household. The Ozarks had long been a place where people came to disappear, whether from the law, from debts, or simply from society itself. Among those seeking such isolation was the Thurman family, who established their homestead in Crow Hollow in 1881, purchasing 40 acres of rocky hillside from a widow eager to return east after her husband's death. Jacob Thurman, a taciturn man of 42, had brought his wife Sarah and their 4 children from Tennessee after a dispute with his former business partner. Neighbors would later report that the Thurmans kept mostly to themselves, appearing in town only for necessary supplies and occasional church services. Their homestead sat at the far northern end of the hollow, where the narrow valley floor gave way to steeper terrain. The property featured a 2-room cabin, a small barn, a chicken coop, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. A natural spring provided water year-round, making the otherwise difficult land somewhat viable for sustaining a family. The children, ranging in age from 7 to 15, were schooled at home by their mother, a former school teacher from Virginia. The family cultivated a small garden plot and kept a few livestock animals for sustenance. Their nearest neighbor lived almost 3 miles away, an unusual distance even by the standards of the isolated hollow. This extreme seclusion would later be cited as the primary reason why the family's absence went unnoticed for so long. The county road, little more than a rutted path, often became impassable during the heavy winter rains and spring floods, further isolating the hollow from the outside world. When investigators finally arrived at the Thurman homestead in June 1887, they discovered a property that had been abandoned for months, with crops untended and livestock long since escaped or perished. The only regular visitors to the remote homestead, it seemed, were the crows that gave the hollow its ominous name. The Blackwood family consisted of patriarch Isaiah Blackwood, 54 inches 1,887, his wife Eliza, 49, their sons Ezra, 31, Jedediah, 28, and Malachi, 26, and daughters Ruth, 23, and Naomi, 19. According to county records, the Blackwoods had relocated from eastern Tennessee, though their history prior to arriving in Carroll County remained deliberately vague. Isaiah was recorded as a farmer and lay preacher, while local accounts described his wife Eliza as knowledgeable in traditional remedies. Neighbors later recalled the Blackwoods as a close-knit but reclusive family who rarely participated in community events. Their homestead, situated at the farthest end of the hollow, consisted of a large two-story log house, several outbuildings, and extensive gardens surrounded by a crude fence of sharpened stakes. Most notable was what locals came to call Eliza's garden, a meticulously maintained plot where she cultivated both common and unusual plants, many of which were not native to the region. The Blackwoods' livestock was limited to a few milk cows, chickens, and a pair of mules, but witnesses reported that the family never seemed to want for meat or other provisions despite minimal farming activity on their rocky land. Isaiah was known to travel for weeks at a time, purportedly to preach in remote settlements, leaving his sons to manage the homestead in his absence. During these periods, few visitors were welcomed onto Blackwood property. Those who did approach often spoke of being watched from windows by silent observers or being met at the property line by one of the Blackwood sons carrying a shotgun. Local children told stories of strange chanting heard from the Blackwood property late at night, and several reported seeing mysterious lights moving through the forest surrounding their land. While most dismissed these tales as childhood imagination, they contributed to the family's unsettling reputation. Court documents would later reveal that Isaiah had a history of legal troubles in Tennessee, including allegations of fraud and assault that had been settled under unusual circumstances. The family's relocation to Arkansas had occurred suddenly, following a fire that destroyed a neighbor's barn and resulted in significant livestock losses. No charges were ever filed, but suspicion followed the Blackwoods to their new home. Perhaps most telling was the collection of personal items discovered in the Blackwood home after the events of 1,887 belongings that would later be identified as having belonged to travelers who had disappeared while passing through Carroll County over the previous 6 years. The first indication that something was amiss at the Blackwood property came in the spring of 1882, approximately 1 year after their arrival in Crow Hollow. According to testimony later provided by Jacob Simmons, whose farm lay nearest to the Blackwood property, strange sounds could occasionally be heard coming from the direction of their homestead late at night. Wailing, that he initially attributed to wild animals, but later found disturbing enough to mention to his wife. More concerning were the disappearances. Between 1,882 and 1,887, at least 3 travelers known to have passed through Crow Hollow were reported missing by concerned relatives. Local authorities conducted cursory investigations but found no evidence linking these disappearances to foul play. The isolated nature of the region, with its dense forests and treacherous terrain, provided ample explanation for travelers becoming lost or falling victim to accident. What raised no official concern at the time, but would later prove significant, was that each of these travelers was last seen heading toward the far end of the hollow where the Blackwood property lay. Hiram Jenkins, a peddler well known throughout Carroll County, vanished in October 1883 after telling the owner of a general store that he had heard the Blackwoods were in need of winter supplies. A land surveyor working for the county disappeared in 1885 while mapping properties in the hollow. Most disturbing was the case of Martha Collins, a young woman traveling to visit relatives in Berryville who reportedly asked for directions to the Blackwood homestead after hearing they might offer lodging for the night. When Sheriff Thomas Whitaker questioned Isaiah Blackwood about these disappearances, he reportedly became hostile, claiming that no travelers had ever reached their property and suggesting that wild animals or bandits were the likely culprits. Several residents reported finding strange symbols carved into trees along the paths leading to the Blackwood property, symbols that Eliza Blackwood explained as protective markings when questioned by the postmaster, who occasionally delivered mail to the family. On 2 occasions, hunters reported finding freshly disturbed earth in the woods surrounding the Blackwood land, but no investigations were conducted. Local physician Dr. James Thornton documented treating Malachi Blackwood for a severe hand wound in 1884, noting that the young man's explanation of a farming accident seemed inconsistent with the nature of the injury, which more resembled a human bite. The case that would eventually expose the Blackwoods' activities began not with murder but with theft. In April 1887, Thomas Miller, a peddler from Springfield, reported to the Carroll County Sheriff that his wagon had been ransacked while he slept at a campsite near Crow Hollow. Among the stolen items was a distinctive pocket watch with a silver case engraved with Miller's initials. 3 weeks later, Ezra Blackwood was observed by storekeeper William Foster in Berryville using this exact timepiece. Foster, recognizing the watch from Miller's description, which had been circulated to local businesses, alerted Sheriff James Hardin. This seemingly minor theft investigation would lead authorities to the Blackwood property on the 17th of May, 1887, a date that would later mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Arkansas history. When Sheriff Hardin and 2 deputies arrived at the Blackwood homestead, they were met with immediate hostility. Isaiah Blackwood stood on his porch with a loaded rifle while his sons emerged from various outbuildings, similarly armed. Only after Sheriff Hardin explained they were investigating a simple theft, not making accusations, did the patriarch reluctantly allow the lawmen onto his property. During questioning, Ezra claimed to have purchased the watch from a traveler passing through the hollow. When pressed for details about this individual, his descriptions remained vague and contradictory. Sheriff Hardin, growing suspicious, requested permission to search the premises for other items reported stolen by Miller. Isaiah initially refused, but eventually relented when threatened with a return visit backed by a larger contingent of armed men. It was during this search that Deputy Michael Collins noticed unusual stains on the floor of the Blackwoods barn. Following this discovery to an area behind the structure, he observed what appeared to be a recently disturbed patch of earth. Despite Isaiah's protests that they were exceeding the bounds of their investigation, Sheriff Hardin ordered the area excavated. What they uncovered was not Miller's stolen merchandise but human remains later identified as those of Peter Sutton, the county surveyor who had disappeared 2 years earlier. Confronted with this evidence, the Blackwood men attempted to flee. In the ensuing confrontation, Malachi Blackwood was killed, Jedediah severely wounded, and the remaining family members taken into custody. A thorough search of the property over the following days would reveal a total of 12 burial sites containing the remains of 17 individuals, many showing signs of ritualistic mutilation. Among the victims were all 3 previously missing travelers, 2 families who had allegedly been passing through the region, and several unidentified individuals whose remains suggested they had been held captive for extended periods before their deaths. Sheriff Hardin's initial visit to the Blackwood homestead was intended simply to question Ezra about the stolen watch. Accompanied by 2 deputies, Hardin approached the property in mid-afternoon. His official report, preserved in the Carroll County Archives, details how the family received them with a cold civility, inviting the lawmen into the main house where Isaiah dominated the conversation. During this interview, Deputy Samuel Taylor noticed bloodstains on the wooden floor, partially covered by a rug. When questioned, Isaiah claimed they had recently butchered a hog. The explanation might have been accepted had Deputy Taylor not observed that the stains appeared to form a trail leading to a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. When asked what lay below, Isaiah became visibly agitated, claiming it was merely a root cellar that wasn't fit for visitors. Sheriff Hardin, now suspicious, insisted on inspecting the cellar. What the lawmen discovered below the Blackwood kitchen would haunt their dreams for the remainder of their lives. The cramped space, accessible only by a narrow ladder, contained 3 small cages fashioned from iron and wood. 2 were empty, but the third held the emaciated body of a woman later identified as Catherine Hayes, a school teacher reported missing from Springfield 3 months earlier. Though still alive, she was severely malnourished and bore evidence of prolonged torture. The walls of the cellar were covered with strange symbols, drawn in what laboratory analysis would later confirm was human blood. A collection of knives, saws, and other implements hung from hooks, while a large wooden table in the center of the room bore leather restraints at each corner. Several jars containing preserved human organs lined a crude shelf, each meticulously labeled in Eliza Blackwood's handwriting. A journal found in a locked chest detailed procedures performed on at least 11 individuals over the preceding 6 years. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be a makeshift altar at the far end of the cellar, adorned with human bones arranged in elaborate patterns. Confronted with this evidence, Isaiah lunged for Sheriff Hardin's sidearm. In the ensuing struggle, both Isaiah and Ezra Blackwood were fatally wounded. Eliza and the remaining children were taken into custody without further resistance. When asked why they had done such things, Eliza reportedly smiled and said only, "The garden needed feeding." A subsequent search of the property revealed 7 graves in the area behind the house, each containing multiple sets of remains. Most shocking was the discovery that the unusually fertile soil of Eliza's garden had been systematically enriched with human remains, with partial skeletons unearthed beneath nearly every plant bed. The space beneath the Blackwood kitchen was not the root cellar Isaiah had claimed. Instead, the lawman found a room approximately 15 feet square, with walls of fitted stone and a packed earth floor. The stench was overwhelming, a combination of decay, blood, and something acrid that burned the nostrils. A crude wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface deeply stained and gouged. Along one wall stood a collection of implements, knives of various sizes, saws, mallets, and tools the lawmen could not immediately identify. Most disturbing were the restraints, iron manacles attached to the table and heavy chains bolted to the stone walls. In the corner lay a pile of clothing, some identifiably female, others belonging to men of different sizes. Perhaps most chilling was the orderly arrangement of personal effects on a shelf, watches, rings, spectacles, wallets, and other items that clearly belonged to numerous different individuals. Sheriff Hardin's report, truncated in the official record but fully detailed in his personal journal, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1935, described their immediate realization. What we had found was nothing less than a chamber of horrors, a place where victims had been restrained, tormented, and ultimately slaughtered like livestock. Deputy Taylor discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose flagstone containing a leather-bound journal written in Eliza Blackwood's precise handwriting. The contents detailed ceremonies performed on various dates corresponding with phases of the moon, each entry meticulously recording the names of victims, their contributions, and the apparent purpose of each ritual. The underground chamber also contained evidence of occult practices unknown to the rural lawmen, including symbols carved into the stone walls that a visiting professor from the university would later identify as combining elements from ancient European and indigenous American traditions, all perverted toward sinister purposes. Most horrifying to the investigators was the small drainage channel cut into the stone floor, leading to a collection vessel that still contained fresh blood, indicating a victim had been processed recently. When confronted with this evidence, Isaiah Blackwood reportedly showed no remorse, stating only that the work was necessary for the greater awakening. Sheriff Hardin noted that what disturbed him most was not the obvious evidence of torture and murder, but the clinical precision with which everything had been arranged, suggesting not crimes of passion but a methodical, almost industrialized approach to killing. Several of the tools showed signs of recent use, their edges still wet, leading the lawmen to believe they had interrupted the family during an ongoing ritual. A small wooden cabinet contained dozens of small bottles filled with various powders and liquids that laboratory analysis would later identify as containing human remains processed into forms apparently intended for consumption. While Sheriff Hardin and Deputy Taylor secured the Blackwood men, Deputy William Cooper conducted a search of the property's outbuildings and gardens. His discovery in what locals had called Eliza's garden proved equally disturbing. Behind a locked gate in the garden center stood a small, windowless structure built of stone. Inside, Cooper found dried herbs hanging from the rafters, jars of powders and liquids carefully labeled in a flowing script, and a large iron cauldron suspended over a fire pit. Most significant was a leather-bound journal discovered beneath a loose floorboard written in Eliza Blackwood's hand. The journal, excerpts of which were later published in the Arkansas Gazette, though the complete text was deemed too disturbing for public consumption, detailed Eliza's experiments with various plants and their effects on the human body. Some entries described concoctions designed to render the subject compliant or induce a state of paralysis while maintaining consciousness. Other passages documented the family's beliefs in what Eliza called the old ways, rituals involving blood, body parts, and incantations that she claimed would grant power, protection, and long life to those who practiced them. The journal revealed that what appeared to local residents as a simple herb garden was, in fact, a carefully cultivated collection of medicinal, poisonous, and hallucinogenic plants, many brought from Tennessee and some, according to Eliza's notes, originating from the old country across the Atlantic. Soil samples taken from various sections of the garden would later show high concentrations of human remains, confirming Cooper's suspicion that the unusually lush vegetation was flourishing on a macabre fertilizer. The garden was arranged in a precise geometric pattern that, when mapped from above, formed symbols similar to those found in the underground chamber. Each section contained specific plants grouped according to their effects. Plants for paralysis, for inducing hallucinations, for causing pain, and for ensuring death. Particularly disturbing was a section Eliza had labeled the Whispering Bed, where plants were growing directly from what appeared to be a shallow grave. When excavated, this area revealed the remains of a child estimated to be approximately 10 years of age. The stone structure also contained human bones that had been processed into powder, which, according to the journal, was used in various ritual preparations. Several jars contained preserved organs labeled with dates and names corresponding to missing persons reports from surrounding counties. Most chilling was Eliza's methodical documentation of which preparations were most effective, with detailed observations of victims' reactions, including how long it took them to die and the specific effects of each concoction. The final pages of the journal outlined plans for what she called the Great Awakening, scheduled to coincide with the summer solstice just weeks away. The full extent of the Blackwoods' crimes became apparent on the investigation's third day when a search party, guided by Ezra Blackwood in exchange for promises of leniency, was led to a remote clearing approximately half a mile behind the family's property. There, in a grove surrounded by ancient oak trees, investigators discovered dozens of shallow graves. Initial excavation revealed the remains of at least 17 individuals of varying ages and both sexes. Most disturbing were the condition of the remains. Many showed evidence of dismemberment, unusual cutting patterns, and in some cases, the removal of specific body parts. Dr. Jonathan Pierce, the county physician called to examine the remains, noted in his report that many bones showed signs of being cleaned of flesh in a deliberate and methodical manner. His conclusion, though couched in the clinical language of the era, was clear. The victims had not merely been murdered, but had been processed like game animals, with certain portions removed for unknown purposes. The clearing itself contained other disturbing elements. A large flat stone that appeared to have been used as an altar, with deep channels carved into its surface to direct the flow of blood, and a series of unusual symbols carved into the surrounding trees, symbols that would later be identified as having connections to certain European folk magic traditions. Further excavation revealed that the burial ground had been in use for considerably longer than the Blackwoods' residence in the hollow, suggesting either that their activities had begun before their arrival in Arkansas, or that the site had been used by previous practitioners of whatever dark rituals the family had continued. Several of the graves contained remains that, based on clothing fragments and personal effects, appeared to date from the Civil War era. Most graves contained multiple victims interred together in ways that formed specific patterns when mapped by investigators. Professor William Thornton, an antiquarian from Little Rock called to consult on the case, identified these burial arrangements as corresponding to astronomical alignments significant in pre-Christian European traditions. Among the recovered remains, investigators identified several individuals who had been reported missing from communities as far away as Springfield, Missouri, and Memphis, Tennessee. The burial site also yielded evidence that the Blackwoods had not been working alone. Personal items found among the graves included a pocket watch belonging to a prominent Berryville businessman and a distinctive ring known to have been worn by a county official who had disappeared while investigating reports of livestock theft 2 years earlier. This suggested the family's influence may have extended beyond their isolated homestead, possibly explaining why previous disappearances had not been thoroughly investigated by local authorities. Among the most damning evidence recovered from the Blackwood home was a ledger found hidden in a compartment beneath Isaiah's bed. Unlike Eliza's journal, which focused on her garden and its applications, this document, written in Isaiah's meticulous hand, detailed the family's victims with disturbing precision. Each entry included names when known, dates, physical descriptions, and notes on how each victim had been lured to the property. Most entries concluded with 2 disturbing notations: offerings listing body parts harvested and yield, cataloging valuables taken. The ledger recorded 73 victims over the 6 years the family had occupied the property, a number far exceeding the remains found in the burial ground, raising questions about additional disposal sites or other uses for the bodies. Particularly chilling were Isaiah's occasional theological reflections interspersed throughout the ledger, in which he described the killings as necessary sacrifices and the tithe of blood that ensures our continuation. These passages revealed a man who had constructed an elaborate religious justification for what was, at its core, serial predation on a massive scale. The earliest entries suggested that the family's practices had begun years before their arrival in Arkansas, with references to previous harvests in Tennessee and, before that, in an unspecified location in Appalachia. Isaiah meticulously categorized victims according to their perceived usefulness, with notes such as strong life force, pure vessel, or corrupted but serviceable. The ledger included detailed information about lunar phases, weather conditions, and astrological alignments corresponding to each killing, suggesting these factors played a significant role in the family's ritualistic practices. Most disturbing were the entries involving children, which Isaiah marked with a special symbol and described as most potent for certain rituals. Several pages contained what appeared to be recipes or formulas requiring specific combinations of body parts, blood types, and personal possessions from victims. Deputy Samuel Taylor, who first discovered the ledger, reported being unable to sleep for weeks afterward, haunted by the clinical detachment with which Isaiah documented acts of extreme violence. The final pages of the ledger outlined plans for what Isaiah called the Great Ascension, scheduled for the summer solstice of 1887, which would have required the sacrifice of 12 individuals over a 3-day period. Sheriff Hardin would later speculate that the investigation had interrupted preparations for this event, potentially saving numerous lives. Most revealing were Isaiah's notations regarding local authorities and community members who he believed could be bribed, threatened, or were secretly sympathetic to the family's activities, suggesting the Blackwoods' influence extended beyond their isolated homestead. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case emerged when authorities questioned the 2 youngest Blackwood children, Ruth and Naomi. Initially reluctant to speak, Ruth eventually provided testimony that sent shockwaves through the investigators and later the courtroom. According to court transcripts, Ruth described being initiated into family traditions at age 12 when she was first brought to the chamber beneath the kitchen to observe and assist in what Isaiah called the necessary work. Her testimony revealed that the Blackwood children had been systematically conditioned from early childhood to participate in their parents' activities, first as observers, then as assistants, and finally as full participants. Naomi, though more reticent, confirmed her sister's account and added details about Eliza's preparations, tinctures and powders added to food offered to travelers that would render them disoriented or unconscious. Most chilling was the matter-of-fact way both young women described the family's practices, suggesting a complete normalization of extreme violence within the household. Ruth's testimony included the revelation that would give the case its folkloric name, describing how certain victims were selected for feeding the garden, their blood and specific organs used to nourish plants in Eliza's carefully tended plots, particularly those growing certain poisonous and hallucinogenic specimens. Court records indicate that Ruth described in clinical detail how different victims were selected for different purposes based on physical characteristics Isaiah claimed could be discerned by those with the sight, a gift he believed had been passed down through his bloodline. According to Ruth, Isaiah taught his children to identify potential victims by looking for specific signs that marked them as suitable sacrifices. Both daughters testified that they had been responsible for maintaining records of the family's activities, with Ruth managing the inventory of harvested materials and Naomi keeping accounts of valuables taken from victims. During cross-examination, Ruth revealed that not all visitors to the Blackwood homestead were killed. Some particularly useful individuals were allowed to leave after unwittingly consuming preparations containing human remains, which Isaiah believed would bind them spiritually to the family's influence. Perhaps most disturbing was Ruth's description of the family's ultimate goal, what Isaiah called the Great Transcendence, a ritual requiring 100 sacrifices that would supposedly transform the Blackwoods into immortal beings capable of exerting their will over the natural world. According to her testimony, the family had reached 78 of their required victims when authorities finally discovered their activities. The trial of the Blackwood family began on the 8th of September 1887 in Berryville, though it was quickly moved to the larger courthouse in Eureka Springs due to intense public interest. The proceedings, which the Arkansas Gazette dubbed the Trial of the Century, lasted 23 days and featured testimony from over 40 witnesses, including law enforcement officers, medical experts, neighbors, relatives of victims, and surviving members of the Blackwood family. The courtroom was consistently filled beyond capacity, with hundreds gathering outside to hear updates. The evidence presented was so disturbing that several jurors requested to be excused, and the judge ordered daily breaks to allow those present to recover their composure. Most significant was the testimony of Ezra Blackwood, who, in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, provided extensive details about the family's operations, how they selected victims, primarily travelers unlikely to be missed immediately, their methods of subduing them, often using Eliza's concoctions, the ritualistic aspects of the killings, and the practical disposal of remains. His testimony revealed that the family's activities combined elements of religious fanaticism, calculated predation, and disturbingly mundane practicality. Victims' valuables funded the family, while their remains served multiple purposes in the Blackwoods' twisted economy of death. The prosecution, led by State Attorney William Harrison, presented the physical evidence methodically, including the ledger, journals, implements of torture, and photographs of the burial ground that caused several spectators to faint. Medical testimony from Dr. Pierce detailed the systematic nature of the dismemberment and organ harvesting found in the victims, confirming that many had been alive during the procedures. Eliza Blackwood, unlike her son, refused any cooperation, maintaining a disturbing silence throughout the proceedings, broken only by occasional utterances in what witnesses described as an unknown tongue. Public sentiment turned increasingly hostile as the trial progressed, with armed guards required to protect the courthouse after a mob attempted to seize the defendants on the trial's fourth day. The defense, such as it was, focused primarily on questioning the mental competence of the accused, arguing that only severe insanity could explain such actions. This strategy collapsed when Ruth Blackwood calmly testified that every family member had been fully aware of their actions and believed in their necessity and righteousness. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Thornton, in his sentencing statement, declared that the crimes exceed in depravity anything known in the annals of American jurisprudence, and that they represented a darkness in the human soul that defies comprehension. Isaiah, Eliza, and Jedediah Blackwood were sentenced to death by hanging, while Ruth and Naomi received life imprisonment. The execution, carried out on the 26th of November 1887, drew a crowd estimated at over 2,000 people, the largest public gathering in Carroll County history. On the trial's 15th day, Isaiah Blackwood surprised the court by requesting to make a statement. What followed was a 3-hour monologue that the court stenographer later described as the most disturbing oration I have ever transcribed. The complete transcript, sealed by judicial order until 1950, revealed the full extent of Isaiah's delusional belief system. He described his family as descendants of an ancient lineage originating in the dark forests of the Old World, charged with preserving what he called the true faith that predated Christianity. Isaiah claimed that the killings were necessary sacrifices to entities he called the Old Ones, who required blood and specific organs to maintain the family's protection and prosperity. Most disturbing was his matter-of-fact description of how the family had conducted similar operations in Tennessee and, before that, in North Carolina, suggesting that the Carroll County victims represented only a portion of their total crimes. His statement concluded with neither remorse nor defiance, but with a chilling prophecy. What flows in our blood cannot be stopped by your laws or your hanging ropes. It will continue, as it has for generations, finding new vessels, new gardens in which to grow. The court records indicate that Isaiah spoke with unnerving clarity and conviction, never raising his voice or displaying emotion as he detailed rituals that had allegedly been passed down through 8 generations of his family. He claimed that his ancestors had fled Europe during the Great Purges, referring apparently to witch trials of the 17th century, and had established their practices first in New England, then gradually moving south and west as settlements expanded. Particularly shocking were Isaiah's claims of an extended network of practitioners across the Ozark region, though investigations would later find no evidence corroborating this assertion. His testimony included detailed descriptions of ceremonies conducted at specific astronomical alignments, the preparation and use of human remains in various concoctions, and the supposed powers these practices granted to faithful practitioners. Several times during his statement, Isaiah addressed individuals in the courtroom by name, including people he had never met, describing personal details about them that he claimed to have seen in the blood. The judge repeatedly considered halting the testimony, but ultimately allowed it to continue, as Isaiah implicated himself in dozens of previously unsolved disappearances across 3 states. Medical experts called by the defense after this testimony unanimously declined to classify Isaiah as insane, with one physician noting, "His delusion is complete and internally consistent, but his understanding of his actions and their consequences remains intact." Following the trial, authorities cataloged over 200 items recovered from the Blackwood property. These artifacts, as they came to be known, provided disturbing insights into the family's activities beyond the killings themselves. Of particular note was a collection of bound manuscripts found in a hidden compartment in Isaiah's study, some appearing to date back to the early 1700s, written in several languages including English, German, and what language experts later identified as a dialect of Middle Scots. These texts contained rituals, botanical information, and genealogical records tracing the family line through numerous name changes and relocations across Europe and America. Also recovered were unusual implements crafted from human bone, containers of preserved organs labeled with dates and names, and a series of detailed anatomical drawings showing which parts of the human body were to be harvested for specific purposes. Most disturbing was a set of childlike drawings found in Naomi's room depicting family gatherings in the clearing behind the property, artwork that showed how thoroughly the youngest generation had been indoctrinated into the family's practices. The county courthouse briefly displayed these items before public outcry forced their removal to a secured evidence room, where they remained until a mysterious fire in 1890 destroyed most of the collection. Surviving photographs taken for the court record show ritual garments made from various materials, including what experts identified as human skin, carefully tanned and stitched with symbols matching those found in the underground chamber. Several journals contained pressed flowers and plant specimens from Eliza's garden, alongside notes documenting their effects when combined with specific human remains. Particularly notable was a family Bible with traditional birth and death records replaced by lists of sacrifices dating back to 1734, suggesting that the practices had continued uninterrupted for at least 153 years across multiple generations. Various personal effects taken from victims had been modified for ritual purposes, including wedding rings melted down and recast into symbolic figurines and pocket watches, whose mechanisms had been removed and replaced with preserved human eyes suspended in a clear solution. Investigators also discovered correspondence between Isaiah and individuals in Tennessee, Missouri, and as far away as Pennsylvania, written in a coded language that, when deciphered, appeared to reference similar practices in these distant locations. Though authorities attempted to locate these correspondents, no arrests resulted, leading some to speculate that Isaiah's claims of a wider network might have held some truth. Among the final items cataloged was a small leather pouch found sewn into Eliza's mattress containing 20 human teeth, each wrapped in paper bearing a name and date, which she reportedly claimed were anchors that allowed her to influence their previous owners even after death. In December 1887, after the trial but before sentencing, the court ordered psychological examinations of all surviving Blackwood family members. Dr. Elliot Montgomery, a physician from St. Louis with expertise in mental disorders, conducted the evaluations and produced a 47-page report that was revolutionary for its time. Rather than simply declaring the family insane or evil, Montgomery attempted to understand the psychological mechanisms that enabled their behavior. His report, rediscovered in 1967 and now considered a pioneering document in the field of criminal psychology, detailed how Isaiah and Eliza had created a closed system of beliefs, reinforced through isolation, religious ritual, and the gradual normalization of extreme violence. Most significant was his analysis of the children, whom he described as victims of systematic conditioning from earliest childhood, who had never been exposed to alternative moral frameworks. Montgomery noted that while Ezra and Jedediah demonstrated awareness that their families' practices would be condemned by society, evidenced by their careful concealment, Ruth and Naomi showed genuine confusion regarding why their actions were considered wrong, a phenomenon Montgomery termed isolated moral development. His report concluded with a disturbing observation. The Blackwood case represents not merely individual madness, but the creation of an entire moral universe separate from and opposed to that of broader society, a phenomenon that may be more common in isolated communities than we have previously recognized. Montgomery documented extensive interviews with each family member, noting that Eliza remained almost entirely silent during her sessions, responding only when questioned about her garden, at which point she became animated and technical, discussing her plants as a botanist might, never acknowledging their connection to human remains. The doctor recorded that Jedediah exhibited signs of what he called compartmentalized consciousness, able to speak normally about everyday matters but becoming rigid and using ritualistic language when discussing the family's practices. Most chilling were his sessions with Ruth, who responded to questions about the murders with the calm precision of someone discussing household chores, at one point asking Montgomery if he required detailed measurements of how much blood could be harvested from different types of subjects. The report included transcripts of Ruth describing how her father tested her loyalty at age 14 by requiring her to perform her first solo harvesting, and how she had felt pride rather than revulsion at his subsequent approval. Montgomery noted that none of the family members exhibited common signs of mental disturbance, such as delusions or disorganized thinking outside their shared belief system, writing that their madness, if we are to call it such, exists not in the structure of their thoughts, but in the premises upon which those thoughts are based. On the 10th of January 1888, Judge William Harrison delivered his sentences in the Blackwood case. Isaiah, Eliza, and their sons Ezra and Jedediah were sentenced to death by hanging. Malachi, who was determined to have been born with feeble-mindedness, likely an intellectual disability, and who had participated less directly in the killings, received life imprisonment. The most controversial sentences concerned Ruth and Naomi, who, despite their youth and upbringing, were sentenced to life imprisonment at the Arkansas State Asylum for the Criminally Insane, a decision that sparked debate about culpability, rehabilitation, and the nature of evil that would continue for decades. The executions were carried out on the 15th of March, 1888, before a crowd of over 2,000 people who had traveled from across Arkansas and neighboring states to witness justice being served. According to newspaper accounts, none of the condemned showed remorse or fear as they approached the gallows. Isaiah's last words, reported by several witnesses, were, "What is planted will grow again." In the days following the executions, authorities made a decision that reflected the unusual nature of the case. The Blackwood property was not merely abandoned or sold, but systematically destroyed. The buildings burned, the well filled in, even the trees in the burial clearing cut down and burned. This extraordinary step was explained in Sheriff Hardin's final report as necessary to remove all traces of the evil that was practiced there and prevent the site from becoming an attraction for the morbidly curious or those who might seek to emulate the Blackwoods practices. Reports from the state asylum indicate that Ruth continued to maintain the righteousness of her family's actions until her death from tuberculosis in 1894, while Naomi eventually renounced her upbringing, cooperated extensively with researchers studying the case, and was released in 1912 after being deemed rehabilitated. She changed her name and reportedly lived quietly in Missouri until her death in 1935, though some accounts suggest she maintained a garden of unusual herbs until the end of her life. Malachi died in prison in 1890, under mysterious circumstances, with guard reports suggesting he had been communicating with unseen visitors in the weeks before his death. The case prompted significant reforms in Arkansas law enforcement, particularly regarding investigation of missing persons and suspicious deaths in rural areas. The Blackwood homestead site remained abandoned, with local residents reporting strange phenomena in the vicinity for decades afterward, including unusual growth patterns in vegetation, unexplained sounds at night, and livestock refusing to graze in the area. In 1923, when the county attempted to auction the land for unpaid taxes, no buyers came forward despite its fertile soil and valuable timber, a testament to how deeply the Blackwood legacy had embedded itself in local consciousness. In the decades following the Blackwood case, numerous scholars have examined the events from different perspectives, contributing to our understanding of this historical horror. Anthropologist Dr. Margaret Sinclair's 1967 study, Old World Beliefs in the New World Wilderness, traced connections between the Blackwoods practices and obscure European folk traditions, particularly those from isolated regions of Scotland and Germany where pre-Christian beliefs persisted alongside nominal Christianity. Her work identified specific rituals, described in Isaiah's writings as corrupted versions of ancient fertility and protection rites. Criminologist Dr. James Wilson's 1978 analysis, Family-Based Serial Predation, examined the Blackwoods as an early example of a family murder enterprise, comparing them to later cases like the Benders of Kansas. His work highlighted how the family structure provided both practical advantages, multiple perpetrators, built-in secrecy, and psychological reinforcement that allowed their activities to continue unchecked for years. Perhaps most significant was historian Dr. Elizabeth Carter's 1995 work, Invisible Crimes, Murder in Isolated America, which placed the Blackwood case within the broader context of 19th century rural America. She argued that the extreme isolation of regions like the Ozarks created perfect conditions for predatory individuals. Victims could disappear without raising immediate alarm. Law enforcement was distant and under-resourced, and communities often valued privacy and self-sufficiency over close scrutiny of neighbors. As Carter wrote, the wilderness that promised freedom for honest settlers offered the same freedom to those with darker intentions. Psychological analyses have evolved as well, with Dr. Robert Thompson's 2003 study, Generational Evil, examining how the Blackwoods systematically corrupted their children's moral development through isolation, indoctrination, and gradual exposure to violence, creating what he termed moral islands, entirely disconnected from societal norms. Folklorist Dr. Sarah Jenkins documented how the Blackwood case generated dozens of regional legends and cautionary tales that persisted well into the 20th century, noting that in the Ozarks, certain hollow places are still avoided, certain family names still whispered. Most recently, Dr. Thomas Harrison's 2018 digital mapping project reconstructed the Blackwood's victim selection patterns, revealing a calculated approach that targeted specific travel routes and seasons when disappearances would be least likely to generate immediate investigation. The case continues to generate academic interest across disciplines, with recent papers examining everything from the botanical knowledge displayed in Eliza's journals to linguistic analysis of Isaiah's theological writings. What emerges from this collective scholarship is a picture not merely of isolated deviance, but of a complex system of belief and practice that existed in parallel to mainstream society, invisible until it catastrophically intersected with it. The physical traces of the Blackwood family have long since vanished from Crow Hollow. The property where their homestead stood remained unclaimed for decades, with locals considering the land cursed. Eventually, the federal government acquired much of the hollow as part of the Ozark National Forest, and today, hikers in the area would find no indication of the horrors that once occurred there. Yet the legacy of the Blackwood case persists in multiple forms. The legal precedents established during the trial influenced later cases involving family-based crimes and questions of culpability among individuals raised in isolated, abusive environments. The psychological evaluations pioneered by Dr. Montgomery helped establish the field that would eventually become forensic psychology. For the people of Carroll County, the case left psychological scars that persisted for generations. Local folklore transformed the Blackwoods from real criminals into almost supernatural figures, bogeymen used to frighten children into obedience. The Witch's Garden became a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in the wilderness and the evil that can hide behind a veneer of religious devotion. Perhaps most disturbing are the questions that remain unanswered. The fate of Ruth and Naomi Blackwood after their institutionalization is poorly documented, with asylum records from that period being notoriously incomplete. Some accounts suggest that Ruth died in the asylum in 1903, while Naomi was eventually released in 1917 after being deemed cured. Her subsequent life, and whether she had children of her own, remain unknown. Isaiah's chilling final prophecy, "What is planted will grow again," continues to resonate, raising the disturbing possibility that somewhere, descendants of the Blackwood line might continue their ancestors' practices in new soil. For the modern visitor to the Ozarks, the dense forests and remote hollows remain as beautiful and potentially dangerous as they were in 1887. Places where one might still stumble upon remains of the past best left undisturbed, or perhaps encounter those who, like the Blackwoods before them, have chosen isolation for reasons of their own. The hollow remains, both in historical record and local memory, a place where the thin veneer of civilization once peeled away to reveal the darkness that can grow in human hearts when nurtured in isolation and warped belief.